We have just finished an authentic, traditional Appalachian breakfast this morning. I'm in here cleaning up. But I was remembering a conversation that my sister and I were having about why recipes are very similar but different. Like my sister's husband, he was born and raised in Kentucky, and then he came over to the area where we grew up. They moved to that area, and we were just talking about the similarities in some of the recipes, how they can be so similar because they're from the Appalachian Mountains but come from such a different area. And I think the reason that is because, a lot of recipes were handed down by families, and then people traveled, and then they'd come back and they brought other recipes to their families. And then another thing we concluded was because the recipes came on product packaging. Now, of course, we had paper bags. Flour came in, but our parents, when they bought flour, it came in cloth bags, and they reused those cloth bags. They reused them for material, made dresses and shirts and quilts and dish towels and all kinds of things from. But when we were growing up, this is how our flour and things traditionally come from packaging. And when the packaging started, you no longer got the cloth to sew your clothes and stuff with, but you usually got a recipe. Back here you can see on this King Arthur bag, there are several recipes. There's one for absolutely no need crusty white bread, and I guess that's the only one on this package. But then there are other things back here, information about your flour. But here is the recipe. And back in my mom and them's day, this would have been a great gift to get this recipe, because not only did you get the product, but you got a suggestion of how to use it. So we think that maybe there are a lot of similar bread recipes, similar basic recipes like for the fried apple pies, different things. There's recipes that are similar because somebody basically used a recipe like this that was included on a package, and then it was passed down. And of course, as things were passed down, they were spoken, not necessarily written. My mom has an 8th grade education. My dad had a 7th grade education. My dad went on to be really successful. We feel like he was successful. He raised 5 children. He had a great job, a good paying job. And we feel like he was a success with no more education than he had. Now, that's the only formal education he had through a school system. But of course, he had many other forms of education. He had learning experience, and he was the kind of guy that you either sink or swim. If he taught you how to do something, he expected you to remember and to know how to do it, because that's how he learned. He could watch somebody else and learn how to do anything that he wanted to do. He was truly amazing in that way. But I was saying all that to tell you that a lot of recipes are just kind of shared. So say you went to the family gathering, you went to homecoming with the church, or you had a holiday, and then somebody had something delicious there that they made. Most of the time, they would not have a handwritten recipe for that. They would not have a recipe. They would just tell you how they made it from memory. And you would either have to memorize it, or maybe you would get a pen and pencil or paper and pencil, and you would write it down, and then it would be a written recipe added to your family recipes. There might even be a note down there of where it came from, or who it came from, what side of the family it came from. And that would be in the family recipes. That's how family recipes were collected. And then as other people made them, maybe they said, well, I don't like this ingredient. I'm going to substitute something else, or I'm going to leave it completely out. So there were There were recipes that were altered because of likes and dislikes through the years, and that's how we get different forms of recipes. But we were thinking about that, how people in the Appalachian area can have very similar recipes, and how some can be very drastically different. And we were wondering, well, how does that all add up? And then as we thought about it, we realized from growing up how it all added up. And so, of course, I love recipes. I gather them wherever I can. I have the recipes that I raised 3 children. Me and Donald have 3 grown children who are married with families of their own. And I was a stay-at-home mom for a lot of that period of time. I did step out and have jobs, but for the majority of the time, I tried to stay at home and raise our children. And that included feeding them. So I've got a whole book. I hope to keep all that and maybe share that one day. But it is a whole book of things that I fed. That's what I raised my children on. Some of that included my traditional Appalachian recipes that I grew up with. And then there are others that we adapted to the time, the convenience time. But we adapted recipes that were different. Like a Salisbury steak recipe. I didn't grow up eating Salisbury steak unless, we had it at somebody else's house. That's not something my mom cooked for our household very often. But I found that when I had, especially teenagers, middle school age to teenage children, that was something that they loved. It was one of their favorite recipes. So we might have that more than once a week. We might have that several times a week because it's something they absolutely love. Salisbury steak with potatoes, green beans, some good sides. And so, we had adapted recipes for our families as they, as we were raising families. So there's a whole thing of traditional Appalachian meals that I have that I was raised with. And then there's a whole meal plans and things that I used when I was raising my children. And of course, I included a lot of traditional foods in there too, like the sankas or cobblers that my dad was raised on. That was a favorite in my family, the fruit cobblers. Now, Daddy was raised a little further down the mountain. He was born and raised in Mount Airy, North Carolina. Mount Airy is a very famous town because of Andy Griffith. But that's how he was raised. He was raised right down in there, and they called their fruit, much like a cobbler, they called it a sonker. That's what Daddy called it growing up. So they were sonkers to him. Mama was raised way further up in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains, way deep up in the mountains. So her version was a cobbler. We had cobblers, and we called them cobblers, and Daddy called them sonkers. But there's a whole thing. I think there's even a sonker trail up there in Surrey County where you can go to different restaurants and taste their sonkas. I think the difference in the sonkers and the cobblers mainly is a cobbler, you mix your fruit into the dough, and a sonker, the fruit's kind of on the bottom, and the biscuits or the dough is up on the top. I think in growing up with both of those, that the sonker is, that's the difference in the sonker and the cobbler. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. And then as we, aged and went to different people's houses, and as we, formed meals for our own children and stuff, the recipes became slightly adapted to our family. And that's the whole thing about those recipes. But we were discussing why are some recipes very, very similar and some very different. And that's the conclusion we came to just from experience in that part of our life. But I love both of them. I love the traditional ways of cooking. I also learned to add in new things. I love to learn to add in new things, different things, all kinds of different kinds of food. I just love to do that. And I have adapted, but there are some staples that will always be staples that were always made and always served, and they're favorites, and there's no reason to change them, so I have some of those too. But thank you for joining me for my little kitchen chat. We were just talking about recipes and how they came about and how they can be so similar in areas that, were pretty far off, and how they can be so different right in our area, our own area, how sometimes we can be making the same recipe and it can be very, very different. Of course, each family, they think their recipe's the best, of course, and then there are some people that think other people's recipes are better because, you eat your own cooking so much that anytime you get something different, it's delicious. But that's just my thoughts on some differences and similarities in the Appalachian recipes. Thank you for letting me share my thoughts with you. I hope this clears it up, some things for you. And if you have any questions, be sure to leave it in the comments. I always welcome your comments, and maybe you have some thoughts or some reasons that maybe some things are different in your own area. If you do, feel free to share them with us. Thank you for joining us today. And like always, until next time.